Hello friends, welcome back to another video on the channel. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Emmanuel. I'm a first year medical student at McGill University. And today I want to talk to you guys about study techniques. So you might be thinking, what does a first year medical student know about studying habits? Or maybe you think that a first year medical student does know what optimal studying habits are. Well, I can tell you from now that I don't know per se what the optimal study habits are, but I do know what cognitive psychology suggests are the optimal study habits. And they suggest this because these are observable things and studies that have tested different study strategies to see which ones yielded the best results. So in this video, I'm going to share those different results and studies and tips and tricks with you. All right, so let's start off with probably the most popular study technique, and that's highlighting. Many people love to highlight their notes, and you might be thinking that's a great tool because I'm highlighting what's important and I could revisit this. And yes, I agree with you that highlighting might be very useful when it comes to really like marking down what the really important topics are in a chapter or in your lecture notes or whatnot, and then revisiting these. But when you're highlighting, are you truly thinking about the material that you're highlighting? Are you truly actively learning the material as you're highlighting? Or you're probably like, oh, this passage is talking about optimal study techniques. Okay, it suggests this, I should probably highlight this. But are you really taking the moment to think about what you're reading, right? And the answer is probably no. And that's why highlighting is a passive learning technique. So it's not necessarily an optimal learning technique. Now, I'm not bashing on highlighting because I think it could be very useful when it comes to really summarizing notes and figuring out where the important concepts are located. But it's not conclusive as to whether or not someone who highlights versus someone who doesn't highlight will yield better results on exams. I, for one, do not highlight my textbook. I hate highlighting my textbooks. I think, it just ruins the beauty of the textbook. So I don't highlight. Do I get bad grades? No. Do people who highlight almost the entirety of their textbook get bad grades? Not necessarily. So that's just something to note. Another popular study technique is rereading notes or rewatching lectures. And this is another interesting one because, subconsciously, you might be thinking that you're covering more material because you're rereading. You're like, okay, I've seen it once and now I'm rereading it. But if you're not actively involving yourself in the process of studying, then is it truly worth your time to reread lecture material? And the answer is probably no. So again, these passive learning techniques are probably not your best friends when it comes to studying. So the first study tip is called elaboration. So what that means is it's important for you to give meaning to what you're studying, especially if it's something you don't like. So for example, if I'm trying to remember the order of the subdivisions of the small intestine, right? I'm thinking the jejunum or jejunum, the duodenum, the ileum, and I'm like, what order does food pass through the small intestine? One of the mnemonics I love to use, and I've been telling everyone about because I heard it in class, is DJ ileum. So through DJ ileum, I know that D stands for duodenum, J for jejunum, and I for ileum, and then that's the order that food passes through the small intestine. And I know this is a very simple mnemonic, but it's just to give you an idea of one way to just really get your brain to recall that information. And let me tell you, it doesn't matter what university program you're in. If you have a lot of material to cover, but you're able to summarize this material through mnemonics, it becomes really, really helpful when it comes to retaining that information in your head and then recalling that information on test day. All right, the next tip is probably the most important one, and that is to test yourself. I can't stress how important this is. For medical school, if you're thinking of applying to medical school or you're in medical school, then you've probably heard of the MCAT exam. and everyone tells you to practice, practice, practice. And that goes for any class you're taking. You know, if it's a calculus class, how do you optimize your grades? Well, you have to practice the different problems. You have to practice the different derivatives and the formulas and whatnot. It's the same thing in medical school. It's the same thing in law school, and in any other program, really. One way that students like to do this, especially in medical school, is through the generation of flashcards. So students either create their own flashcards on Anki, on Quizlet, or their own, handwritten flashcards, and then they test themselves. And it's good because by thinking about how you can test the material, you're actually actively engaging yourself with the material. Likewise, if you get a flashcard from someone else, like, in medical school, we have a student that created flashcards, and most of the medical students use these flashcards. Well, I might not think like this person. So I'm actually getting a different point of view on the material and how it could be tested. And then that allows me to actively engage with the material in a different way. So creating your own flashcards or completing flashcards from someone else that's maybe taking the same courses as you is a very, very useful study technique. Of course, in an optimal world, you have question banks, you have test banks, you have practice tests that you can do. Those are probably the best way to study for an exam. Okay, so another way you can optimize your studying is through organization, and that might be an obvious one, but what I mean by organization is creating tables and creating what are they called? Organizational trees. These are great study techniques because, for example, if I'm studying the gastrointestinal tract, right, and I want to talk about the different inflammatory bowel diseases, and now I'm thinking about Crohn's disease and I'm thinking about ulcerative colitis, I could learn the individual, histological markers, pathophysiology, clinical symptoms, complications. I can do that individually, or I can do that while comparing one versus the other. They're both inflammatory bowel diseases, but by having a comparison table, I'm able to identify the key differences in each one that kind of makes them stand out from one another. And that way I'm able to better appreciate the similarities and differences, especially the differences between these two types of inflammatory bowel diseases. Another tip or trick is to take breaks. So your brain will get fried if you are studying 12 hours in a row without any breaks, without any food, without any water, without any just mental breaks or distractions. It's very hard, first of all, to go 12 hours without getting distracted. And if you can do that, kudos to you, but I can't. I personally study in 1 hour increments. So people talk about the Pomodoro technique. And if you're not familiar with it, you should look into it. But essentially, very quickly, it's a technique that shows that you could study for 25 minutes and then take a 5-minute break, or you could study for, 50 minutes and take a 10-minute break. So I kind of follow that, although I'm really not strict about it. I will take an hour to study and then take as long as I need really to take a break and come back, mentally ready and strong to tackle another lecture, another chapter or whatnot. So again, take breaks. And my final technique or trick, we'd like to go on a trip, but not a trip. A trick for you is active note-taking. So in this modernizing world, we are quite comfortable using laptops and tablets and all sorts of devices to take down notes. Now, this can be great when you're attending a lecture and the lecturer speaks very quickly and you're trying to jot down all of your notes. Because I, for one, can't write fast at all because I'm a perfectionist when I write. But I can type about 85 words per minute, which is pretty good. So that, for me, when I'm in person, I take computer notes. But when I'm at home, I like to summarize these notes and make handwritten notes. Now, there was a study that's called The Pen is Mightier Than the Sword. And this is an interesting study that compared the performance levels of two groups, one that were taking handwritten notes and one that were taking computer notes. And believe it or not, that study found that people who took handwritten notes outperformed the people who took computer notes. Now, the hypothesis is that the people who took computer notes, yes, they were able to write down word for word what the lecturer said. But if you think about it in class, if you just take a moment to think about yourself in class. I, for one, when I'm in class and I'm writing all these notes, I'm trying to keep up with the lecturer, especially if they speak fast. Am I really, absorbing the material, or am I just copy pasting word for word what the lecturer says? It's most of the latter than the former, right? But for people who are handwriting notes, well, if they can't keep up with the lecturer, then they have to think about ways to summarize the material. And by summarizing the material, putting in key words, you get a deeper encoding of the information, which allows you to learn and consolidate that information even better. So that's probably the reason as to why the handwritten group outperformed the computer note-taking group. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't take your notes on computer. Like I said, for me, my favorite strategy is to take really defined notes on the computer, like perfectly word for word what the lecturer says, so I don't miss any key information. But then I like to take that and summarize it, and let's say I write 3 pages of notes on the computer. I like to make a 1-page summary by hand, and really focusing on the key concepts that I pulled away from that lecture. So again, that's what works for me, and that might not necessarily work for you. So these are just a couple of the many study techniques that you can adopt, right? Some people like to take their iPad and open up the PowerPoint presentation and start doodling on it. And that might be another way that you're actively engaging with the information. But I think the most important thing that keeps coming back is this active involvement when you're studying, whether that's flashcards, whether that's active note-taking, whether that's quizzing yourself or getting other people to quiz you. At the end of the day, active learning is the best kind of learning. So with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, please leave them down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, I'll see you all in the next one.